do hope that you are enjoying this tour through Stoic philosophy as much as I am. It's a tradition full of rich insight, careful and subtle argument, but also just plain beautiful texts. And so I take a kind of special pleasure in reading this literature. In our last discussions, we were talking about the work of Seneca and Epictetus, two early Stoic philosophers. And today we get to talk about the Stoic philosopher who is perhaps the most beautiful writer of them all, the great Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius. But before we do that, I want to take a slight digression to talk a little bit about the Epicurean philosophy of Lucretius. The reason that I want to do this is that one of the things that is distinctive about the work of Marcus Aurelius is its synthesis of Epicurean and Stoic philosophy. The Stoics emphasized the importance of controlling the emotions, the importance of a rational life and a social life. The Epicureans really focused on interdependence, causality, and our finitude and death. And it was Lucretius who was probably the most influential of all of the Epicureans. We know very little about Lucretius. He lived from about 99 to 55 before the Common Era, and he wrote only one very short work called De Rerum Natura, The Nature of Things. That work was extremely influential. Beyond that work, we know almost nothing at all about his life. Lucretius argued that death should never be a problem for us. There's nothing wrong with death. The reason that death causes us so much difficulty, he argued, was our fear of death. While death is inevitable, Lucretius argued, the fear of death is not inevitable. If we think calmly and rationally about death, we can accept its inevitability as one terminus of our life without terror, without fear, and then death can cease to haunt our psychology. Lucretius points out that we were nothing before we were born. That if we imagine our lives in the history of the universe, there's an infinite period of time before we existed. There's nothing terrifying about that infinite period of time. Nothing tragic about it, nothing sad about it. None of us sits around lamenting, oh, for billions of years in the universe, I was not here. How terrible, how horrible, how sad. We don't do that. On the other hand, after we die, there will be an infinite period of time in the history of the universe when we will not be present either. Lucretius's point is that we lament that. We say, oh my gosh, when I die, I'll be no more. There will be all of this time without me. How terrible. But Lucretius points out the symmetry in this situation. Our lives are but a very short interval, bounded by infinite periods of our absence. If the absence before our lives is no problem, the absence after our lives should similarly be no problem. On the other hand, he says, when we become obsessed with death and fear death, that drives us to anxiety. We try to do things to forestall death. We worry incessantly about what will happen after our death. And it generally infects the quality of our life. What happens is two really terrible things. The first is that the constant anxiety and worry about death prevents us from experiencing the tremendous amount of pleasure that is available to us in our lives. Lucretius emphasized that life could be a beautiful, wonderful, very pleasant thing, but that we ruin it by overlaying the irrational fear of death and so infecting our living with a constant anxiety. The second thing, of course, is that fear of death leads us to do stupid things. It leads us to do stupid things like, for instance, trying artificially to prolong our lives with means that have no hope of doing that. It leads us to try to preserve the illusion of youth long after that illusion is appropriate. It leads people to dye their hair or to use oil of Olay or things like that to try to preserve this illusion of youth. And in the end, once again, the fear of death contaminates what life that we have. Following the Stoics, Lucretius argued that external phenomena should be of absolutely no consequence to us because we can't control them. We can control our internal reactions to them, and that's what's important. So Lucretius argued that not that we shouldn't think about death. He thought we should think about death. We should think about it carefully. We should think about it clearly. And as a consequence, we should come to recognize that death is no great evil, that it's absolutely nothing that we have to fear. Interestingly, Lucretius considers two possibilities. One, that there is a God. Secondly, that there's no God. Of course, the Stoics thought that there was, but Lucretius, as an Epicurean, thought probably there wasn't. But he argued that whether or not there's a God or an afterlife, death is absolutely nothing to fear. If there is an afterlife, we have no idea what it is, so we have no reason to fear it. If there's no afterlife, then there's nothing at all there to fear. So whether or not there is, he argued, think about death, think clearly about it, conceptualize it, recognize that it's perfectly natural and that it's no different from your birth, and relax and enjoy the life that you have. It's these Epicurean themes that Marcus Aurelius stirs together with Stoicism to generate his own particular brand of Stoic philosophy. Marcus Aurelius himself is a fascinating character. He became emperor of Rome in the year 161 of the Common Era. But before that, he was a very serious student of philosophy and literature. He was extremely well-read. He studied with many of the leading scholars of his day, and he was somebody who really didn't want to enter the civil service and become emperor. But he was adopted into an imperial family, and it was his destiny to do that. He worked in the Roman civil service and apparently was known as a very capable, very honest, very decent administrator. Studied both Stoic and Epicurean philosophy, and then had this complicated reign as an emperor. The problem was that Marcus Aurelius was a pacifist. He was somebody who really tried to get Rome at peace and tried to make peace on the Roman borders. But he was constantly forced to fight border wars, especially in Northern Europe, to protect the safety of the empire. So he was a reluctant warrior in that sense. And the meditations that we'll be addressing, the text that he left behind, which he in fact called To Myself, because it was his journal, it was his evening diary, was written while he was in a military camp in Northern Europe. And you can imagine the kind of irony of this situation. Here's somebody who didn't want to become emperor, but he's ended up being forced by circumstances to rule the greatest power in the Western world. Once emperor, he didn't want to be a military leader, but was forced by circumstances beyond his control to wage nearly constant wars. As an emperor, what he would have really loved to have done was to sit in his palace and study philosophy. But the war isn't going well, so he decides he himself is required on the front. So we find him in a muddy military camp somewhere in Northern Europe, reluctantly leading an army in a war he's reluctant to fight. And so in the evening, he writes his diary, To Myself. And what we have is that diary, which we call the Meditations. It's written in beautiful scholarly Greek. And when we read the text, in a sense, the order isn't important. Most of it are independent notes, except for the first book. Book 1 is an introduction to the entire text. The rest of it is a diary of thoughts in no particular order. The text, the Meditations, as we call it now, introduces both Stoic and Epicurean themes. From the Stoics, Marcus Aurelius draws a conviction that there's a rational order to the universe. He draws the thesis that humans are essentially in a unity with the cosmos, and hence that we are essentially rational. He inherits the idea that our emotions are to be controlled, as they are fundamentally irrational. He even uses the arrow and target analogy. He also emphasizes our social roles and the social duties that we have as governing the outlines of our lives. And of course, he was somebody who was acutely aware of that, leading a life determined by a social role that he was forced to assume. The Epicurean themes he introduces are an emphasis on our finitude, a constant focus on the impermanence of things and the constant flux of reality, and a real preoccupation with death and thinking rationally about death. Of course, he wasn't too many years from his own death when he was writing this, and he probably knew it. Marcus Aurelius, like Seneca, worries about the therapy for anger and attachment. And like Seneca, what he urges is that we remind ourselves that cooperation is natural to us, and that unpleasantness in others that might lead to anger is a fault in them, not an insult to us. And you can't be angry at people for the faults over which they have no control. He urges that we depersonalize things. When things occur that seem to be aimed at us, realize they're just events in the world, and we don't have to take them personally. That we can notice external things, but the internal judgment, which leads us to react emotionally, can be detached, and we can remove that. He urges not only that we detach ourselves from aversive external things that might lead to anger or sadness, but also from what is attractive, that things that seem beautiful to us, desirable to us, also give rise to emotions. Those emotions are just as irrational as anger, and so detachment there is appropriate as well. The echoes of the Gita are really important here. And he always asks us to remember the rational order of the universe, of our role in it, and the importance of self-control. So let's now spend some time with this absolutely glorious text, and we're going to begin with Marcus Aurelius' admonition regarding the naturalness of cooperation. And remember, he's writing to himself as much as he is to us. He says, "Say to yourself in the morning, I shall meet people who are interfering, ungracious, insolent, and antisocial." It's true, isn't it? You will too, I'll bet. They have all become like that because they have no understanding of good and evil. But I, who know that the nature of the wrongdoer is of one kin with mine, the same portion of the divine, I cannot be harmed by any one of them. I cannot feel anger against him who is my kin and hate him. We were born to labor together like the feet, the hands, the eyes. To work against each other is therefore contrary to nature. I hope you can hear the echoes of Epictetus on the foot here. The idea that we work together as the parts of the body do. That anger requires us to see things in the wrong way. And that if we see things in the right way, there is no cause for anger. Marcus Aurelius also asks us to depersonalize the whole thing. He says, discard the thought of injury, and the words, I have been injured, are gone. Discard the words, I have been injured, and the injury is gone. The point is really simple. So something annoying may have happened. Somebody may have done something that displeases me, or that hampers my pursuit of my own objectives, or even that hurts me. But I can detach myself from that. I can say, all right, these objectives have been thwarted. There's some pain here, but if I don't personalize it and see it as something that happened to me, then I don't need to think of it as an injury to me and as a cause for anger. He continues, what does not make a man worse does not make his life worse and does him no injury, external or internal. Just because somebody thwarts me, it doesn't make me a worse person. So it doesn't really harm me in any deep way. Then Marcus Aurelius advises us to detach our judgment from the external, to recuse ourselves from judgment. He says, that part of you which judges that it is bad, let it make no such judgment, and all is well. Even when that which is closest to it, your body, is cut, burned, let the judging part of you keep calm. That is, it's one thing to note that an injury's been done. It's another thing to decide that that's a terrible thing and demands a response. The unpleasantness, the irrationality, the failure to live up to our nature comes when the judgment occurs, not when the external phenomenon occurs. But here, we also find the admonition to detach ourselves from what's attractive, because those emotions are just as irrational as the others. And here Marcus Aurelius is quite eloquent. He writes, how useful, when roasted meats and other foods are before you, to see them in your mind as here the dead body of a fish, there the dead body of a bird or a pig. Or again, to think of Falernian wine, which I presume was really good wine, as the juice of a cluster of grapes, of a purple robe, as sheep's wool dyed with the blood of a shellfish, and of sexual intercourse, as internal rubbing, accompanied by the ejection of mucus. What useful images these are. Are you finding them useful? I hope so. They go to the heart of things and pierce right through them so that you see things for what they are. In what sense do they go to the heart of things? They go to the heart of things because they describe things in a completely neutral, objective, rational manner. A manner that does not call upon us to issue a positive judgment, to become attached to them, to develop desire, and so to overcome our rational selves, the selves that can engage in useful, cooperative behavior with a kind of emotional response that undercuts everything that's natural, everything that's beneficial about us. Marcus Aurelius emphasizes the order of the universe and the need for self-control that entails. He says that we should remember always that we're part of a well-ordered universe. We're an integral part of that. The whole, the social whole, the national whole, the physical whole, depends always on the proper functioning of its parts, just as a body does. And our own happiness as individuals, as parts of that whole, depends on the success of the whole. We can't be happy if the world that we live in is unhappy. And that world can't be happy unless we do our part. So we owe it to ourselves, he argues, as well as to the universe of which we're a part, to act dependably, rationally, cooperatively, and that requires control of our irrational impulses. So here we have Marcus Aurelius integrating Stoic and Epicurean ideas in service of that insight. He writes, "You must remember what kind of ordered universe you are a part of. Remember that. You're part of an organized, rational universe. Of what kind of governor of the universe you are an emanation. Remember, here we're drawing on Stoicism, the idea that the universe is governed by the rational god Zeus and that our reason is part of that rational principle. And what a time limit has now been set for you." Here we have the Epicurean themes. "And that if you do not use it, it will be lost, and there will be no further opportunity." Here the idea is very important, that since our time on earth is limited, focusing on that will entail that we will value the moments that we have and not lose opportunities, because an opportunity lost in this life will not be repeated. And then he urges, always keep this thought in mind. What is the essential nature of the universe, and what is my own essential nature? How is one related to the other, being so small a part of such a great whole? We're asked to keep in mind that the essential nature of the universe is rational, well-ordered. My own essential nature is that too. And it is that because I'm a part of this larger universe. For that reason, I have an obligation to realize my nature in a rational, moderate life. Now, impermanence and finitude are important themes for Marcus Aurelius for a whole lot of reasons, and he emphasizes them in many different contexts. He emphasizes, following Lucretius, that cessation of everything is natural and has to be anticipated and accepted. And that's true of external phenomena, but it's also true of ourselves. He also emphasizes that nothing is really as important as we think it is. We tend to put too much emphasis on things which can be treated very lightly, especially on ourselves. We take ourselves and our projects too seriously. That it's important to develop a large perspective, a global perspective on what's a very small world, and that excessive concern for minor impermanent things is just vanity. But on the other hand, there are things that are important. What's important is to live rationally, and that this can be meaningful and accomplished in the context of the finitude and impermanence that makes some things trivial and others important. And he also emphasizes that there is genuine beauty in finitude and impermanence. That's important. It's a theme that we're going to be seeing picked up in some Asian philosophy as well, in particular in Zen. But what we're going to see here is Marcus Aurelius noting that finitude and impermanence aren't tragic. They're often the context in which value can be created. Value can be created there partly just because our moments are so few, because they're so rare, they become important. If we lived forever, no particular moment would be important. But also because often the real sources of beauty that we find are in the impermanence and the cessation of things. So he writes, "Time is a river of things that become with a strong current. No sooner is a thing seen, then it's swept away, and something else is being carried past, and still another thing will follow. The emphasis here is important. The very nature of things is to be constantly changing and to be constantly in flux. If we ignore that, if we try to stop time, if we try to stop change, if we try to, for instance, obsess on trying to look young or to act young or to preserve things which are naturally impermanent, we're engaged in a futile fight against the nature of reality, which is to be in constant change and constant flux. If we're to find meaning in our lives and to find life meaningful, the only way that we can do that is to find that meaning in that impermanent flux. He continues thinking about cessation in this context. The cessation of each thing is no less the aim of nature than its birth or its duration. I want to pause on that phrase for a moment. If any of you have paid any attention in your lives to Buddhist philosophy, someplace we'll be going in a very few lectures, you'll know that from the standpoint of Buddhism, we think about the three phases of all existence: birth, duration, and cessation, and say that all phenomena come into being dependent upon causes and conditions, endure for a short time, and then pass out of existence. So here in Marcus Aurelius, we have that same Buddhist insight. It's quite possible, though we don't know for sure, that some of those ideas may have indeed traveled from Buddhist India over the Silk Road through Persia to Greece and Rome, and that there might even be here some actual impact of Buddhist ideas on Greco-Roman ideas. But we don't know that for sure. Just wanted to point that out as a really interesting connection, and we'll come back to it again when we talk about Buddhism in a few lectures. Marcus Aurelius continues. As when a man tosses a ball, in what way is it good for it to rise or bad for it to drop? How is it good for a bubble to form and bad for it to burst? And the same can be said for the flame of a lamp. So it's one thing, he says, to notice that things arise, endure for a short time, and cease. It's another to follow that with a value judgment, that it's great for them to come into being, perfectly cool for them to endure, and somehow tragic and something to lament when they cease. That, he says, is irrational. Then he argues, nothing that we encounter is really all that important, something that should cause us to have these overwhelming emotions. He asks, of what kind are all the objects of sense, especially those which entice us by means of pleasure, frighten us by means of pain, or are shouted about in vainglory? How cheap they are, how contemptible, sordid, corruptible, and dead. Upon this, our intellectual faculty should fix its attention. Who are these men whose voice or judgment make or break reputations? What is the nature of death? Here, Marcus Aurelius is urging us to take the long view, take the cosmic view, think about the world as a whole. Almost everything that we obsess about in our lives, he says, is really very brief, very momentary, very local, hardly worthy of obsession, even death itself. He emphasizes this by arguing that our world, the entire planet we live in, is but a speck, and concern for small things is quite vain. He says, this is an absolutely wonderful remark, the man who thrills at the thought of later fame fails to realize that every one of those who remember him will very shortly die, as well as he himself. So will their successors, until all memory of him is quenched. And I do not mean that praise is nothing to you when you're dead, but what is it to you while you live? So to the extent that we crave recognition, to the extent that we crave fame, we're craving something that is so fragmentary, so momentary, so ephemeral, that it's hardly worth our attention at all. Nonetheless, Marcus Aurelius argues, a rational life can be meaningful despite this impermanence, despite this flux, despite this finitude. He argues, in human life, time is but a point, reality a flux, perception indistinct, the composition of the body subject to easy corruption, the soul a spinning top, fortune hard to make out, fame confused. To put it briefly, physical things are but a flowing stream, things of the soul, dreams and vanity. Life is but a struggle and a visit to a strange land, posthumous fame but a forgetting. What then can be a man's escort through life? That is, where can meaning be found? And he answers, philosophy. I'll repeat that. He answers, philosophy. And this is to keep the spirit within him unwronged and unscathed, accepting what befalls it. That is, what is assigned to it as coming from the other world from which it came itself, and in all things awaiting death, with a mind that is satisfied, counting it nothing else than a release of the elements from which each living creature is composed. For this is according to nature, and no evil is according to nature. And so Marcus Aurelius concludes very explicitly here that philosophy is what allows our life to be meaningful. Now, he doesn't mean being a philosophy professor, say like me. I wish he did. But what he really means is that reflective thought, understanding, coming to terms with our life, coming to terms with our impermanence, coming to terms with our rationality, and gaining control of ourselves, that's what makes our lives meaningful, because that's what allows us to live in accordance with nature. Moreover, he argues, there's great beauty in impermanence, and this is quite lovely. He says, we must also observe closely points of this kind, that even the secondary effects of nature's processes possess a sort of grace and attraction. To take one instance, bread, when it's being baked, breaks open at some places. Now, even these cracks, which in one way contradict the promise of the baker's art, somehow catch the eye and stimulate in a special way our appetite for the food. And again, figs, when fully mature, gape. And in ripe olives, their very approach to decay adds a certain beauty of its own to the fruit. Ears of corn, too, when they bend downwards, the lion's wrinkled brow. So he emphasizes that all of these tokens of impermanence, all of these tokens of transience, are in fact things of great beauty, and that if we appreciate impermanence in that way, life can be a very beautiful thing indeed. That's coming from the Epicureans. And he advises us, see that you bestow this present time upon yourself. But also, of course, we need to be mindful of death. He writes, this is lovely, think continually how many physicians have died after often knitting their foreheads over their patients. How many astrologers after prophesying other men's deaths? How many philosophers after endless debate about death? Paladins, tyrants, entire cities. Yesterday a spot of albumen, tomorrow a mummy. Therefore, make your passage through this span of time in obedience to nature, and gladly lay down your life as an olive when ripe might fall, blessing her who bore it, and grateful to the tree which gave it life. Isn't that lovely? Marcus Aurelius is pointing out here that we can really not only be calm and confident about death, but welcome death if we think of our lives as wholes in which death is but the very natural terminus, a terminus which can give our lives beauty in the same way that all of these tokens of impermanence can give beauty to the objects in which they occur. We'll see reflections of this much later in our discussion in Buddhism, in Tolstoy's work, and in the work of the great Native American philosopher Lame Deer. And when we come to that, I'm going to ask you to remember Marcus Aurelius. And he says, of course, that we have to face death calmly, in the conviction that it's possible. You may depart from life at once, act and speak and think in every case accordingly. But to leave the company of men is nothing to fear. If there are gods, they will take care of you. If there are not, everything simply ends. So in Marcus Aurelius, we have this terrific synthesis of Stoicism and Epicureanism, emphasizing the rational order of the world, the importance of control of our emotions, and putting that in the context of this overwhelming and contextualizing vision of the finitude and impermanence of things. Marcus Aurelius offers us a vision of a rational, happy life, a meaningful life in what might appear, if we approach it emotionally rather than rationally, to be a meaningless universe. It requires a kind of detachment from strong emotions. It requires a cultivation of calm responsibility, an acceptance of reality, and the discovery of beauty in the finitude of the world, and serenity in our own finitude. Here we see the tradition of Greece that began in the work of Plato and Aristotle in its full flower, an emphasis on the rational, an emphasis on a moderate social life, an emphasis on that as the life that's truly meaningful, an emphasis on the need to transcend the animal part of our nature, the appetitive part of our nature, and to take our role in society seriously, and above all, to be reasonable. But notice how radical this also is. This is a real rejection of the passions as something that's natural and something that we ought to welcome. It's very much more akin to the admonition in the Gita of developing a discipline in order to be truly free and in order to recognize our true nature. We're going to leave Europe now. Our next stop is going to be China. In our next lecture, we're going to be examining the Confucian tradition. From there, we'll move on to a discussion of Taoism. Here, we're going to see a very different version of this complicated dialectic that we've been exploring in India and Greece and in the biblical tradition between social role and individual autonomy. And we're going to be raising further questions about the relations of human beings to their social, natural, and to the cosmic orders.